Christopher Nowinski is the CEO of the Concussion Legacy Foundation. He's a former U.S. college football player and retired professional wrestler. He's also a Harvard graduate and has suffered from the effects of concussions. He's been instrumental in encouraging the families of deceased professional athletes who suffered from concussions to donate their brains for medical research. And as you can see, he's with me now in the studio. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Thanks for coming in to speak with me. Before I get an idea of what you think the message needs to be to Canadian parliamentarians looking at this issue, tell me a little bit about your experience and what brings you to this place committed to making changes around this issue.
So I got into concussions the hard way. You know, I grew up never knowing what a concussion was. And so it wasn't until I played football at Harvard University and I wrestled for the WWE. And it wasn't until I was 24 years old to get kicked in the head that I got my first diagnosed concussion. The problem was I didn't realize it was serious, so I lied about it, and I developed post-concussion syndrome. And that's basically changed the entire course of my life because I've essentially had a headache for 15 years. And I realized that, you know, I shouldn't have had to go through that, and a lot of other athletes are going through that. If we just handle concussions the right way, we can prevent this from happening.
Give me an idea of what it's like to live with those concussion symptoms you describe as that headache for 15 years. Tell me about the ups and downs. Well, not many ups. The downs of that kind of an injury.
Yeah, it's hard to appreciate what happens when your brain actually gets injured. But for me, it was literally like I sometimes just wish I wasn't awake because my head was throbbing. I developed a sleeping disorder, so I'd act out my dreams. For a while, I'd chase shadows. Then that turned into I would wake up about once a week thinking I was choking to death, and I couldn't separate reality from sleeping. And so that was really tough on me and my wife. So it was just, and then like working and everything else, concentration, needing more sleep. It was a spiral that just, it was a miserable 10, 15 years, but I'm finally feeling a little bit better.
Why do you think there's such a spotlight on this now?
Well, we've put a big spotlight on this, and I think part of that's been driven by our work in partnership with Boston University to actually look at the brains of athletes when they've passed away, and military veterans. But what we've realized is that we can see the damage now. There's damage in a lot of different ways, but now that we have that evidence, we can have a conversation about it. Concussions have always slipped under the radar because they're an invisible injury, right? We all look normal once we wake up or once we realize we're okay, but it's actually leaving a legacy in our brains. And so now that we can see what that looks like, we can actually work on treating it and preventing it.
What's your message to lawmakers in this country?
Well, the message to lawmakers in this country, in our country, around the world, is that this is a real public health crisis, but it's easily fixed. You know, we all grew up in a sports environment, you and I, where we just ignored our brain health, and we just would gladly go whack our heads and deal with the consequences. Now we realize that was the wrong way. So how do we change our culture and advance the science so that we can change the culture so it doesn't happen to the next generation, and advance the science so that we can fix those of us who are damaged?
So how do you do that?
Well, changing the culture really comes down to having a conversation in every household. So we're very excited at the Concussion Legacy Foundation that our partners here at CLF Canada actually have a robust grassroots program where they find young leaders at colleges, usually ex-athletes who are wanting to go into sciences and become doctors. And they actually go out in the community and train kids on here's what a concussion is, because you don't realize it until you've had it, and here's what you do about it, which is rest and don't rush back and make sure you're cleared by a medical professional. But it really comes down to having that conversation in every house that you need to know what this is and you know how to deal with it, and you should be okay.
Let's talk about it. I mean, clearly that's starting at a lower level and trying to get, and that's clearly the right place to start, right? People and I guess where I'm headed with this is more information allows you to take more control of your body. And if you're a professional athlete, that's a big deal because we hear a lot about that in professional sports today, that, you know, it's the team concept comes first. You play for the team. You want to play for the team. You want to do well. There's profit involved. There's all of that. And so knowing from a young age that you have to have respect for your own body and know when you're injured. But how big of a challenge is that against a culture that still exists that's about, you know, in certainly male professional sports, manning up and show up?
Right. And then that culture is for men and women. But you make a good point that what we're also doing is we're fighting not just the youth sports culture, but really the professional sports culture. And sometimes it sets the wrong example for us at home. So we watch sports on TV, we see somebody get a concussion, and sometimes they're back too soon, right? It happened, I heard yesterday in an NHL game that a player who clearly was concussed was allowed to go back in. And they do that because there's a lot of money on the line and because there's conflicts of interest, and it's a whole issue. But we're also not just fighting the science in this, but sometimes we find we're fighting the NHL, sometimes we're fighting the NFL, because this message isn't necessarily good for business. And when you're talking about people with money on the line, sometimes they don't make the best choice even for themselves.
But if they leave it that way, I mean, there must be a message to these teams as well. Look, as this becomes a more discussed, more open, more talked about, and having followed sports my whole life, and clearly you have too, there does seem to be, there's at least now in the NHL a concussion protocol, the NFL too as well. Teams are now starting to think of, look, we have to be seen to be doing something about this, and maybe they're not doing enough, but if they don't do enough, there's also, once it becomes so pervasive that people want action, then you start, okay, you should have known better. Now you're looking at major lawsuits, right? I mean, that's
You're
the other
exactly
side
right.
of this.
We've made it so that you can't do the wrong, if you do the wrong thing, someone's going to call you on it. And we both do that. The legal system is doing that with lawsuits. We also have a program where we're educating members of the media and broadcasters on how to talk about concussions the right way on the air, so that kids are learning when there's millions of them watching a hockey game.
Right. So do you see a role for governments if and I guess it's in, well, they'll be at the amateur level as well, but is there a role for governments in saying, look, if protections aren't coming fast enough voluntarily, we need to step in and regulate?
Absolutely, and that's been our experience in the United States, is that we were asking sports leagues to do these things, and they said no. So then we moved the legislative route, and there's now laws in every state in the United States that says every athlete needs education on concussions. You can't go back to the same game when you're hurt, and you have to be cleared by a doctor. And that does exist in Ontario with Rowan's law. But I just had lunch with Gordon Stringer, Rowan's father. It's been very slow in going national.
Right.
But again, this is a public health crisis. We're talking about kids' brains here, and we're talking about very simple changes. So I do hope we're able to convince Parliament to actually do more on this, both on the educational front and legislative requirements, but also starting to think about this as how do we actually advance changing the culture on this? Because let's be honest, now that I'm older, I realize we hit kids in the head way too much in sports, and there are consequences for that, and we don't have to. Right. And so let's change sports. Let's start talking about why.
Yeah, is that a realistic option? I mean, when you talk about how professional leagues don't necessarily want to entertain doing all perhaps that they should to deal with concussions, is there really a place for a conversation about saying, look, imagine the NFL with you got to tackle, so the NFL with no.
Well, we have a very
no head contact.
Let's separate it. Let's draw that line, because you're talking to somebody who used to let people hit him in the head with chairs for my job when I was a professional wrestler. Like, I'm okay with adults doing a dangerous job if they know what they're getting into and protections are taken for them, right? If that's how you want to make a living, that's fine. But when we start talking about should kids be doing the exact same sport by the exact same rules when there's no money on the line and their brain is still developing, that's insanity to me. So in the U.S., we actually convinced U.S. soccer to ban heading of soccer balls before age 11. USA Hockey has raised the age of checking from 11 to 13. It's been raised here in Canada as well. Perhaps it keeps going, right? Why do we need 13-year-olds who are proficient checkers? Is that for the NHL, or is that for the kids, right? So it's changing that mindset, and it has to come with education and having a conversation with people around the table, because we do have these long-term problems. And it's only been, in our experience at Boston University in our brain bank, we've diagnosed 7 of the 7 NHL players we've looked at with this degenerative brain disease, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, most recently Todd Ewan. And then we've also seen, we published that 4 of 8 young hockey players, all 30 years old or under, none of whom ever played in the NHL, also had this disease, CTE. All 4 of them died by suicide, coincidentally. So this is a serious issue that we need to deal with.
Listen, a great conversation. I'm glad we had a chance to talk, and we'll see if the message resonates. I think it will. It's certainly picking up backing and steam in this country, and thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.